Do you believe you're a good person? Calm, kind, measured. The type who avoids conflict, thinks before speaking, hurts no one. At least, not on purpose. Maybe you've even built your identity around that image. Someone who is gentle, empathetic, controlled. But what if I told you that image isn't the whole story? What if it's not goodness, but self-protection? There's a part of you you've tried to forget. A part that doesn't care about right or wrong. A part that is primitive, reactive, unfiltered. Carl Jung called it the shadow. And the less you face it, the more it controls you. Ever said something sharp, then wondered, why did I say that? Felt anger that didn't match. The moment judged someone before you even knew them. That wasn't your logic. That wasn't your better nature. That was the shadow, leaking through the cracks. Jung wrote, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Your empathy might just be fear, dressed as virtue. Your patience might be suppression, masquerading as strength. If you're ready to uncover the psychological forces that truly drive human behavior, subscribe now, because we're about to explore the uncomfortable truths about power, morality, and the hidden darkness that shapes success. In a world obsessed with being nice, no one teaches you how to be whole. So if you're ready to see what's been hiding behind your smile, we have to go back, not to yesterday, but to the very first moment you learned that part of you was unacceptable. You were not born ashamed of yourself. That was taught. As a child, you were pure expression. You cried when you were overwhelmed, laughed without restraint, demanded what you wanted without apology. Your emotions were raw, unfiltered, honest. You lived as you were. Imperfect, impulsive, alive. And then, the training began. Boys don't cry. Good girls don't get angry. That's rude. That's selfish. That's too much. Be quiet. Sit still. Be nice. From a very young age, you started to receive a message. Certain emotions are not acceptable. Certain desires must be hidden. And if you want to be loved, you must become someone easier to handle. This is where the mask begins. What Carl Jung called the persona. A carefully curated version of yourself, built for approval, tailored to survive. You learned to smile when you were hurting, to nod when you wanted to say no, to shrink when your authenticity was too big for the room. And like a coat that doesn't quite fit, you kept wearing that persona, hoping one day it would feel natural. It never did. The truth is, that mask was never you. It was the version of you that earned safety, but safety came at a cost. Because for every trait you showed to gain love, there was something else you had to hide. Your anger, your defiance, your curiosity, your sensuality, your ambition, your pain, all of it. Pushed down, buried, locked behind a door in your unconscious mind. And what lived behind that door became the shadow. But here's where most people get it wrong. The shadow isn't just made of the dark. It also holds the light you abandoned, the talents you were told were arrogance, the opinions you silenced to avoid rejection, the creativity you were told was too much. Imagine a child who speaks boldly, asks inconfortable questions, thinks outside the box, and is told they're difficult, disrespectful, or weird. Eventually, that child stops showing up. But that voice never really disappears. This is how we fracture. We show the world one version of ourselves while hiding everything else, in the name of fitting in. And the more skilled you became at performing, the more distant you became from who you actually are. Now, you might believe you've outgrown your childhood, but your patterns didn't disappear. They evolved. They adapted. You still hesitate to speak your truth. You still swallow your rage. You still reject your own intensity. And deep inside, the parts you buried continue to live, waiting for a moment to be seen again. This isn't just psychology. It's survival. Because the child in you learned something critical. Not everything you are is allowed. But what happens when that buried self refuses to stay silent? When the mask starts to crack and the real you begins to leak out. Most people think their worst moments are accidents, out of character slips, a bad day, a lapse in judgment. But if you've ever exploded over something small, said something cruel, and then thought, why did I say that that's not like me? You've already met your shadow. It's the version of you that operates in silence. The part that isn't polite, composed, or rational. It waits beneath the surface. Not sleeping, just hidden. Carl Jung warned us, the shadow doesn't shout. It whispers. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because it doesn't show up as a monster in the mirror. It shows up as your mood, your tone, your passive-aggressive comment, your silence when you should have spoken, your outburst when you swore you'd stay calm. The shadow moves through everyday moments, through irritation, sarcasm, judgment. It takes over when you're triggered, and you don't even notice. Have you ever found yourself quietly resenting someone who's confident, someone bold, expressive, unapologetic? That discomfort you feel, that tightness in your chest, is a sign you're not reacting to them. You're reacting to the part of you that you've buried. Jung called this projection. We see in others what we deny in ourselves. The louder the judgment, the deeper the wound. When you mock someone online for being fake, who are you really mocking? When you dismiss someone's success as luck or ego, What part of you feels small? What part feels unseen? Most of us don't recognize our shadow because it wears a costume. It doesn't come to destroy you. It comes wearing your name. It says, "This is just who I am. My personality, my boundaries." But often, it's not authenticity. It's camouflage. Emotional camouflage. What we call preferences are sometimes fear in disguise. What we call values might be defenses built around old pain. The shadow doesn't want you to grow. It wants you to stay familiar, safe, predictable. Even if that safety is miserable. Even if it keeps you stuck. Because change threatens the system. And anything that threatens the mask activates the shadow. Think about self-sabotage. How many times have you been on the edge of something important? A relationship, a breakthrough, a decision that could shift your life, and found a way to ruin it. You delayed. You picked a fight. You disconnected. You convinced yourself you didn't care. And later, you couldn't explain why. That wasn't your conscious choice. That was your unconscious protection. The shadow stepping in to keep you in the known. Because the known, even when it hurts, feels safer than the unknown. The shadow also shows up in jealousy that feels irrational, in envy that you mask as critique, in hatred you don't understand. These aren't flaws. They're messengers. Every time you feel an emotion that's bigger than the situation, you've likely touched something buried. And it's not just about what you dislike. Sometimes, it's what you admire that reveals the shadow, the qualities you envy in others. Their confidence, creativity, freedom might be the very traits you once disowned in yourself. So here's the truth. The shadow isn't just the worst in you. It's the unclaimed in you. It's the parts you abandoned to belong. Now imagine this hidden part didn't just whisper, but had a stage, a permission slip, an opportunity to take over. What happens when your shadow isn't just leaking through, but leading the way? We like to believe that cruelty comes from others, from the broken, the damaged, the bad ones. It makes the world easier to sort. Safe, black and white, them and us. But real life is rarely that clean. And history has shown, again and again, that so-called good people are capable of unthinkable acts under the right conditions. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo set out to test this idea. He gathered a group of ordinary, healthy college students. No criminal records, no history of violence, just young men. They were randomly assigned roles. Some would be prisoners, others guards. The setting, a simulated prison in the basement of Stanford University. It was supposed to run for 2 weeks. It lasted only 6 days. Within hours, the transformation began. The guards, who just days earlier were joking, gentle, thoughtful, became authoritarian, cruel, dehumanizing. They insulted, isolated, deprived prisoners of sleep, dignity, and control. And the prisoners, trapped in the roles they'd been given, began to break down. They cried, begged, collapsed emotionally. Zimbardo had to stop the experiment, not because someone got hurt, but because the line between performance and reality had completely disappeared. The lesson was clear. Evil is not a character trait. It is a potential, one that lives inside all of us. And when the environment removes accountability, when authority grants permission, that potential comes alive. Zimbardo called it the Lucifer Effect. How good people turn evil when structure collapses and power goes unchecked. You don't need to be a monster to do monstrous things. You just need the right conditions, or the wrong ones. These insights into the dark psychology of human nature will continue throughout this channel. Subscribe to explore more uncomfortable truths about power, manipulation, and the hidden forces that drive success. Years earlier, Stanley Milgram conducted a different experiment. Participants were told to administer electric shocks to a stranger every time that person answered incorrectly. What they didn't know was that the shocks weren't real. The reactions were staged. The people they thought they were hurting were actors, but they kept pressing the button. Some with hesitation, some without, despite screams, cries, and pleas. Over 65% of participants continued delivering shocks when instructed by an authority figure. Why? Because obedience to authority can override personal morality. Because people are trained to follow rules, not question them. Now, consider this. You no longer need a lab coat or a badge or a simulated prison. All you need is a screen, anonymity, a sense of detachment. And suddenly, good people say things they'd never say face to face. They bully. They humiliate. They cancel. Because the mask of accountability is gone, and the shadow has space to breathe. You don't need a uniform to become cruel. You just need an excuse. A story that justifies your anger. A narrative that paints someone else as the enemy. And in that space, your shadow emerges, fully dressed as righteousness. Carl Jung spoke of the internal. Zimbardo studied the external. One focused on the parts of ourselves we repress, the other on the environments that awaken them. But together, they form a full picture, because what you bury doesn't stay buried. It waits. And when the conditions allow, it takes over. You may never find yourself in a prison, but you've already felt the tug. The moment when envy turns to sabotage, when judgment becomes contempt, when anger slips into cruelty. So, the question is not, are you capable of darkness? The question is, have you already allowed it? But what if your shadow is already in control? not through extreme acts of evil, but in the tiny, invisible ways you sabotage your own life. Let's be honest. You probably see yourself as a decent person. You try to do the right thing. You avoid harming others. You care about fairness, kindness, justice. But here's the deeper question. Is that who you really are? Or just the version of you that the world rewards? Because there's a difference between being good and appearing good. And in today's world, we've confused the two. Many people aren't virtuous. They're well-behaved, trained, socialized to suppress what's messy, unpredictable, or uncomfortable. They've learned to smile through resentment, to nod politely while quietly judging, to offer help that's secretly a bid for power, admiration, or control. And when you peel back that thin moral layer, what you often find isn't peace, but repression. Carl Jung understood this. He said, "Enlightenment is not about imagining figures of light, but about making the darkness conscious." Yet most people skip the second part. They strive for light without ever facing what they've buried in the dark. The result, they live as fragments, morally polished on the outside, spiritually fragile on the inside. Because the more you cling to the idea that you're a good person, the harder it becomes to acknowledge the parts of you that are not. And those parts don't disappear. They distort. They surface in other forms. They leak out through passive aggression, subtle cruelty, emotional manipulation. You've seen this before. Jealousy disguised as a casual critique. Control, dressed up as concern. Ambition cloaked in the language of service. This is the shadow in disguise. Not crude or obvious, but refined, socially acceptable, even praised. Today, we call it virtue signaling. Performing morality not as a commitment, but as a brand. We post empathy. We speak inclusion. We share quotes about kindness. But what happens when we turn off the screen? Are we still kind, still humble, still self-aware, or do we secretly resent the very things we claim to support? There's also something called toxic positivity. The pressure to always stay upbeat, grateful, forgiving, to see the bright side, even when your world is falling apart. This might sound healthy, but when positivity is used to avoid pain, it becomes another form of repression. Because not all sadness needs to be rebranded as growth. Not all anger needs to be neutralized with a mantra. Sometimes, your discomfort is the most honest part of you. And when you bypass it, you bypass yourself. You see, real growth requires friction. And friction often comes from within. From confronting the parts of you that feel selfish, tuetti, jealous, arrogant, weak. You may say you're humble, but why does someone else's success make you feel small? You may say you don't care about recognition, but why do you feel invisible when you're not praised? These moments are not moral failures. They are mirrors. Your shadow isn't the worst in you. It's the most disowned. And the more you try to suppress it with your goodness, the more power it gains behind the curtain. Because nothing is more dangerous than the person who believes they have no darkness. Spirituality, without shadow work, is costume. Kindness, without self-awareness, is performance. And goodness without inner truth is hollow. So here's the hard truth. You are not as good as you think. And that's not an insult. It's an invitation. Because only when you stop defending the illusion can you begin to reclaim the whole. So, if your shadow is real, active, and shaping your world, how do you take back control? By now, you've seen the shadow. You've felt its presence behind your actions, in your reactions, in the silence between who you are and who you pretend to be. But here's what almost no one tells you. The shadow does not want to destroy you. It wants to be integrated. It wants to be seen, promsedi, and brought into wholeness. Carl Jung called this process integration. And it's not just a concept. It's a practice, a way of living. We call it shadow work. And it begins with one question. Simple, but not easy. What in me do I not want to admit exists? This is not about blame. It's about ownership. You cannot heal what you continue to deny. And you cannot evolve by pretending the darker parts of you are not real. So how do we begin? Start with radical honesty. Grab a pen, a notebook, or an open file, and write what you would never say out loud. What you fear, what you resent, what you envy, what you secretly desire. No filters. No editing. No performance. This is called shadow journaling. It gives the unconscious a voice and gives you the chance to confront it consciously. The second practice is trigger tracking. When you feel a strong emotional reaction, pause. Ask, what part of me is being threatened? Is this about now? Or is it about something I've never resolved? Because most triggers are not about the present moment. They're echoes, reverberations of unmet needs and unprocessed pain. And your shadow uses them as openings. But beyond awareness, there's another level. And it's internal dialogue. This is where internal family systems, or IFS, becomes powerful. Rather than treating the shadow as a monster to defeat, IFS teaches you to relate to it as a part of you. A wounded, protective part that developed for a reason. So when you feel that wave of jealousy, anger, or insecurity, you don't shame it. You turn toward it. You say, I see you. I know you're trying to protect me. But you don't need to run the show anymore. This shift from judgment to curiosity is what unlocks healing. And then there's the body. Because your shadow doesn't just live in the mind, it lives in your shoulders, your jaw, to your breath, your gut. This is where somatic awareness comes in. The tightness before you speak, the shallow breath when you feel exposed, the tension you carry but can't explain. These are not random sensations. They're memory, stored emotion, buried narratives your body never forgot. To access the shadow, you must also listen with your body, not just your thoughts. This is not about indulging the shadow. It's about giving it form, so it no longer hides in formless chaos. Because what you resist persists, but what you meet with presence transforms. And no, this work is not glamorous. It is not pretty. It is not shareable on social media. It is uncomfortable, raw, confrontational, but it is also freeing. To face your shadow is to walk through fire and come out forged, because true strength does not come from perfection. It comes from wholeness. You stop being controlled, not by pretending the shadow isn't there, but by making peace with the fact that it is, and that you have the power to choose who leads your life. But even when you integrate, the work is never done, because the shadow doesn't die, it evolves. If this exploration of shadow work has awakened something in you, if you're ready to continue this journey of psychological integration and personal power, then subscribe, because the path to true strength requires facing what others won't. You've spent most of your life trying to be what others would accept. You wore the mask. You played the role. You hid what was inconvenient, unacceptable, or misunderstood. But the more you pushed it down, the more power it gained, until your shadow wasn't just influencing your choices. It was shaping your reality. Now you see it. The patterns weren't fate. The sabotage wasn't random. It was you, driven by the parts of yourself you refused to face. And now, you stand at a threshold. You can either keep running from the fire or step into it and be changed. Because your freedom begins where your denial ends. This is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. So here's the question. Which part of your shadow do you struggle to accept the most? Let me know in the comments. Because the more you speak it, the less it controls you. And when you're ready for the next step, watch the video that follows. It may be the conversation your soul has been waiting for. You can burn or be burned. The choice is no longer far away. I'll see you there.